Hello and welcome back to Headline Geopolitics. This is your host, José Niño. And this evening, I have the pleasure of being joined by Carl Zha, one of the best commentators on Chinese politics and history. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you.
I've been following your channel for some time, and you bring a very unique perspective to commentary about Chinese affairs and its broader geopolitical agenda. So before we start diving into the meatier parts of this discussion, could you let our audience know more about yourself and what got you to start this channel focusing on China and its overall worldview?
Sure. So I'm Carl Zha. I'm the host of the Silk and Steel podcast. I was born in China back in 1976, 1 month after Mao died. So I'm the first post-cultural revolution generation that grew up in China. I spent all of the decades of 1980s growing up in China, going to elementary school, junior high, and my dad came to US to study for PhD back in 1985. So he's also one of the first post-cultural revolution generation of Chinese students who went to study abroad. And in 1989, Tiananmen Square student protest happened, and that's when my dad decided he was not going to return to China as originally planned. And so he decided to bring me to US in 1990. So that's how I came to US. I went to junior high, high school, college, and then I have always been very hungry for news from my homeland. So I delivered New York Times in high school, so I had a habit of reading New York Times every day. But one thing I did notice was their reporting on China seems to be a little off, because when I read about China in New York Times, this is almost like reading about a bizarro world, which does not match my lived experience. So I chalked that up as, okay, Westerners just could not understand the mysterious Orient, right? It's too much. But then when I started working around late 1999, 2000, I came across this expat magazine that was started by a bunch of American expats living in Moscow. This was Matt Taibbi, Mark Ames, John Dolan. It's called Exile.
Exile, yes.
Right. And I was a big fan, and because I was also interested to find out what's happening in the post-Soviet Russia. So one thing the Exile has opened my eye is the way the Western corporate media reports on countries that's deemed potential enemy or unfriendly regime, whatever. So Matt Taibbi, before he went mainstream, now Matt Taibbi became like a creature of the Silicon Tech bros. But before he went mainstream, he wrote an expose on how Western mainstream media would report on Russia. Basically, everything is from a template. And I remember he will write, like, the example he used was he was going to Tashkent to do an interview, but he would already have the story already written up on the plane arriving in Tashkent, and he just need to fill blanks of like the names of his interviewee and so on and so forth. And that's when I recognized this very similar pattern on American reporting on Russia with America and the Anglo media reporting on China. It's very similar. Everything is from a boiler template. In Russia's case, they will they blame everything on Soviet Union, even though Soviet Union by then has already collapsed for more than 10, 20 years, for more than 10 years. And so I realized it's not due to cultural misunderstanding that they don't get China. It's actual active propaganda aiming toward the English-speaking audience. Then comes Trump, the first Trump era. That's when kind of the Sino-American relationship really took a nosedive. And when Trump first started putting sanctions on China, there's a lot of the propaganda really got ratcheted up to 11. So at that time, I felt, okay, I need to speak out on my own experiences as a Chinese American who have lived in both countries, who are fully bilingual, bicultural. I just wanted to share my experience from a perspective of a Chinese person. And somehow I end up gathering a large audience on Twitter, and then later I expanded to YouTube. So this is what driven me to do my podcast, because I just wanted to share, at least from a Chinese perspective. There are too many Chinese talking heads, so-called China experts in the Western media, who either have never set their foot in China. I'm talking about Noah Smith. I know he on my show he admitted he has never been to mainland China, and people who may have been in China but barely speaks the language, right? And I know, for example, the economist, journalist Epi Gottstein, who has stayed in China for almost 20 years and speak terrible Chinese. And so these people, they're really not connected to how the Chinese people really think or thought. So I thought at least I provide a value by opening that window to my Western audience. What is the Chinese perspective on things? So this is how I started what I do.
That point you raised about how when you were in your early teens, with delivering the New York Times and just reading it, really got my attention, because I imagine that was in the 1990s, correct?
Yes.
So that is interesting, because I was always under the impression that there was more positive coverage of China in like the 90s and early aughts compared to, say, like the 2010s, for example, when the pivot to Asia started, when the US started taking like a more like a hostile type of posture towards it, like officially. But in this case, what would you say were some of the flawed perspectives that you instantly saw when you read like New York Times in the 90s that began to make you realize that like this stuff is just disinformation at best and outright lies at worst?
Well, at that time, there actually, back in 1990s, there simply just wasn't that much coverage of China, because at that time, China hasn't really taken off yet. And so whatever reporting you might find in pages of New York Times about how China's human rights situation deteriorating day by day, year by year. And I was reading about that. I'm like, compared to when? Like, it's getting worse compared to when? Because I live, I grow up listening to the stories my parents, my grandparents share about the horrors of Cultural Revolution, right? So I know that times were really bad back then, right? And my experience growing up in 1980s China is that things were gradually getting better and better year by year. So when they say, oh, things are getting worse, like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, are you talking about things were worse than the time when Nixon visited China? I mean, that's obviously bullshit. Because at that time, before China opened up, back in 1972, it's a lot more regimented. I'd say China on an individual level there is a lot more freedom in the 1980s China than in 1970s China, and more in 1990s China than 1980s China. That has been the gradual trend. For example, in 1980s, people who graduate college, they would be assigned a job, a government job, usually. You don't even get to pick your careers. You get assigned a job, right? And that's not a thing after 1990s, because afterwards, you go find your own job. That's fundamentally different, and in my opinion, better than before. The society become a lot less regimented. There's a lot more opportunity abound for people as the economy took off. So I just thought, and I saw the effect of the reporting of New York Times. I would talk to people in United States, about China, and they will always tell me, oh, China is this like kind of hell on earth type of place where it's rampant. It's all like sweatshop, child labor, slave labor, essentially. I mean, that story persisted till today. People still think the Chinese economic success is based on slave labor, which couldn't be further from the truth. If you look at the wage income of Chinese workers, it steadily rose throughout the years. Back in 1980s, China was desperately poor place. It barely made anything on its own. It had to import everything, including chemical fertilizers. Back in 1980s, China was a net oil exporter. It exported crude oil to Japan, but it had to import fertilizers because China didn't have its own enough refineries to refine those processed crude oil to make them into plastics, fertilizers, and more useful goods. So it was basically functioning as your typical third world country. It was exporting raw commodities, receiving manufactured goods. Everything was imported, including like transistor radio, TV, color, fridge. Like when my dad went to U.S. As a PhD, he will send remittance back. That allowed us to buy a color TV in 1984. We bought a Japanese TV, not because we're not patriotic Chinese citizens, because that was the only thing that was available, and because China didn't start making refrigerator until 1986. So this was a whole different world from like made in China of 1990s, 2000, and today. At that time, China exported commodities, received manufactured goods. And so as China opened up its economy, invited foreign firms to come to China to set up factory. And then they started to do what's called import substitution. Now they start to make the goods that they used to have to import for the domestic market. And gradually, they build up the scale to enable exports. So now, you go to China, most of the goods are not everything is made in China, essentially. So that was a big change. And throughout this process, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, right? So the idea that somehow China only prospered because of slave labor, I mean, it itself is kind of weird. Like, what do you mean? How did a slave labor run economy grow to be, the world's most powerful manufacturing house? So a lot of that had to do with, a lot of these talks about China at that time has more to do with domestic American politics, because this was at the 1990s. Was at the early days of globalization, right? When
good point.
When NAFTA was being signed, for example, and so at that time there's a lot of anxiety and fear within U.S. And when people talk about China, often they're not really talking about China as the country that exists somewhere. They're actually talking about they're projecting their own fears onto China as a foil to the real problem that existed in the United States at the time. And of course, at in the 1990s, a lot of the problem was the problem that carried over from 1970s when the Wall Street started to outsource manufacturing overseas. And that process started long before China opened up, because initially they outsourced factories to other countries in Asia, for example, first Japan and then Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, all the Asian tiger economies. And then when China finally opened up by joining the WTO in the early 2000s, those multinational then went to move their operation from other parts of East Asia to China. But for US, when a lot of this media, corporate media, essentially controlled by the same interest that was doing the offsourcing in the first place. The Wall Street elite, they control a lot of these newspapers and the US media. Of course, they don't want the fingers be pointing to them. And it was a lot easier just to blame China for taking your jobs. Essentially, what China actually did is they believe if you build it, they will come. They build out the infrastructure. They gave preferential tax incentives for other foreign firms to come set up shop within China, and they also had the advantage of a large educated labor force. Of course, that's also very cheap, affordable compared to other places, because China in the 1980s was a poverty-stricken place. I mean, not gonna lie. But they did what they did. They did have a highly literate workforce who can easily be trained, and that is they have. China developed not to eat the lunch of the United States. China developed because the Chinese people are trying to do better for themselves, right? That's a key. In US, it always positioned the kind of the American decline is because the rise of China, which but if you look deeper, you can see a lot of the Americans' problem are self-inflicted. The real problem is the financialization of the economy, is the dominance of the Wall Street elite in setting agendas of everything. Now that also included the tech bros from the Silicon Valley, and so those are the fundamental problems. But the people who do control the media in this country, in the United States, they don't want you to, pointing the fingers at Wall Street elite. They just look at China. So I think that's a problem.
Yes, I've just been perplexed by some of these narratives as well about China, especially the slave economy, because if you look at the US, like its history, you did have a slave economy in the South up until the Civil War, and it was clearly less advanced than the North by pretty much every metric. Also, one thing I do find fascinating about China is that it's gone through significant upheavals, especially after the Communist Revolution. You mentioned the Cultural Revolution, then the Great Leap Forward as well. What explains China's progress from the Cultural Revolution until the present? What reforms would you say catapulted it to like an emerging power?
So, this period of Chinese history was very controversial because everyone have their own take on it. What China did right after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 was investing in public education. Because before 1949, only 20% of the people in China was literate. 20%. And that changed by the time China started opened up in 1978, that proportion has been changed to like 80-90%, which is a huge drastic change. And especially if you consider the population itself grow multiple in that time period. In the 1950s, there's maybe about 500 million Chinese. By 1980s, there's already 1 billion Chinese. So the population more than doubled. And yet the education level went up. So that's key. That's one thing a lot of the communist country do well, is raising literacy. But again, there were a lot of political turmoil in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, as you already mentioned, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution. That held back the Chinese development for decades. So in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, he basically said, okay, enough of that. It's time to focus on economic development. Let's abandon ideological struggles, right? Because before 1978, the emphasis in China was on class struggle, one reason Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, he felt the society was backsliding back into like a old hierarchical society where a technocratic elite, but this time led by the Communist Party, was ruling over the masses. So Mao's Cultural Revolution is to overturn that, to destroy basically the Communist Party bureaucracy that he had initially helped to set up. But when then came to power, he said, okay, let's forget about all that ideological stuff. He famously said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. So he's arguing for pragmatism. And Deng Xiaoping also famously said, socialism is not about poverty. It should not be a worship of poverty. If we, as socialist countries, if we claim that somehow our ideology is superior than the other capitalist countries, and yet if our people live in poverty, how does that show superiority of our system? Only by providing common prosperity for all people in China, then can we demonstrate we have a better system. So this is a major shift in mindset. And to that extent, they open up the economy. They start to allow private ownership. They start allow the private businesses to flourish. And they start to welcome foreign investment into China. So initially in the 1980s and 90s, the main source of investment into China was not multinationals. It's actually overseas Chinese who live in places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, or from Southeast Asia. The overseas Chinese capital was the initial driver to power the investment into the Chinese economy, because they for the longest time those overseas Chinese capital, they fled mainland China because because China at that time was doing all these struggling the capitalists and all that. So when they sense the change in the wind, they start to come back to make money. And because it was a golden opportunity. China has a huge internal market. It has a huge labor force that's well educated, yet at a very affordable rate, because China has been behind the bamboo curtain for so long, and that built upon itself. So first of all, in a way, China is kind of following the development path of other East Asian economies. If you look at what happened in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, Singapore, etc., they all started somewhere. This all started from a very a low base, but then they benefited. These countries first benefited from American capital when U.S. started to evolve itself in wars in East Asia. Japan, the post-war Japan, they got their boost when Korean War happened. A lot of manufacturing. The Japanese factories start to gear their production to provide for logistics of American militaries who were going to Korea and to supply the American militaries in Korea. And very similarly, in Korea, they got their boost when U.S. was going to waging war on Vietnam. They also got the military contract to supply the U.S. Army. Korea even sent hundreds of thousands of their own troops to fight in Vietnam for America. To which they receive a compensation from the United States. So this is how these countries got started. But then they also benefited when U.S. Wall Street types start to offshore manufacturing to Asia. They were the first beneficiary. And what happened is through this process, these countries and people in this region, they start to develop their own technical expertise in manufacturing. And when China finally opened up, now here is a vast new market, vast new pool of labor source, affordable source of labor. Now, all these other the factories that were in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and their factory owners, then they start to move their factories into mainland China itself, where the labor is even cheaper than Taiwan and Hong Kong. That happened all throughout Asia, and this very few people in the Anglophone world understood that dynamic, unless they were living in Asia at the time, witnessing kind of that transformation, how the capital crossed the borders. But so that's what happened. Except the difference this time is China is on a much bigger scale. It's much bigger than Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, even combined. And so that is what made a difference. Is that the economy of scale now made even more economic sense for business to continue to concentrate to build in China, because China now they have built the whole ecosystem of supply chains. All these different you can source all these different components from within a very small geographically located area. For example, the Pearl River Delta around Guangzhou, around Hong Kong and Shenzhen, that whole area. And it makes economic sense then to even build more manufacturing over there, because there you would get all the parts, all the components. But so that's what really drove the Chinese economic miracle. One is educated workforce, two is access to capital, and but of course, most importantly is the government finally recognized that the way to grow is to be pragmatic, to not to exclude the foreign investment but welcome it. But these are complicated, nuanced development happening in China that it takes time to understand and to digest. For Western media, what they're selling a very simple narrative, which is China is taking our lunch, right? Which is a lot more digestible on your daily commute, for example, to work.
Beyond the misconception about Chinese slave labor, what do you think are the most notable myths that you see Anglophone pundits say about China?
Where do I start? I mean, okay, one thing is, one thing I often hear is, okay, it's the United States that made China great, right? It's actually not China that lifted 800 million people out of poverty. It's United States by trading with China that lifted 800 million people out of poverty, which makes you think, if U.S. could do that, why didn't U.S. lift its own people to a better living standards? I mean, there's still a lot of poverty in U.S. today, and U.S. still have dilapidated infrastructure.
Or even most of Latin America, too.
Yeah, if U.S. could do that for China, why didn't U.S. do that for Americans at home, right? I mean, this is a very simple question. And, U.S. American business, they never went to China to do charity. Okay, let's make that clear. They went there to make money. And that everything else just is justification. Like one of the common reframe about America intention toward China is like, oh, the Clinton era. So during Clinton era, during that round of globalization, they had to justify domestically why we're trading with China, why we're moving factories to China, for example. So the way they justify it is saying, oh, we're going there because the trade will help to liberalize China, to transform China into a democracy. But look, that is BS. That nobody actually believed that. They went to China to make money. They only say that. Yeah, they did not. Yeah, they did not go to China to liberalize China or make China a more open society. They say they would have. That's just one of their selling points to convince the American public why they were shifting, offshoring manufacturing to East Asia. But now they were saying, oh, that was a mistake because we thought we could liberalize China. But no, look, the reason why United States did what it did was not to make China a strong peer competitor. The reason why United States at that time moved a lot of production to China because they thought China will continue to remain a vast pool of cheap labor that will make shoes and phones for United States. U.S. is perfectly happy with Chinese making low-end product. Like they, even if they believe the slave labor narrative, they're happy with it. They're happy with it as long as they get their cheap stuff made in China. However, it changed. Everything changed when Chinese started to move up the value chain. They started going from making phones for Apple to make their own branded, Chinese branded cell phone. And they started to make electric cars. Before US was, there was a time when foreign automakers completely dominated the Chinese car market, which, by the way, today, the Chinese car market is twice the size of US car market. They sell somewhere around like 30 million vehicles in China every year. But for up to 2020, about 5 years ago, foreign ownership of the Chinese car market is about 80%. GM, Ford, they're all making money head over heels in China. In fact, around 2010, I went to visit China. One of my dad's friends' kid, about my age, she was a manager at GM China, and she was like, "Man, what the hell what's Americans doing, man? Like, why is the GM America going bankrupt? We're making tons of money over here. Like the GM China is really profitable. Yeah, what the hell are they doing? Did they do with all the profit we generated over here? Why did they go declare bankruptcy back in US?" So even then, GM was making a lot of money. KFC, by the way, is on every street corner in China. Like, this is one of the most popular chain in China. You can go. By the way, KFC China also tastes much better than KFC in America because it's true. People can go try it out. But the word they did not try. China did not try to block out American businesses from going to China. This is how Elon Musk were able to open the Shanghai Gigafactory, which actually made Tesla profitable for the first time. I'm kind of going on rant a little bit, maybe off to tangent. I'm trying to remember your original question.
Just any other myths about China that you constantly hear in the media? Because I see a lot of talking points with regards to China that are repeated.
So one of the things is about how China got worse today by stealing American IP and technology and all that. And I don't deny there's probably industrial espionage. There's probably there were some copying of designs, because that's how Huawei got started, when they basically tried to copy what Cisco router did. That's how Huawei got its start. But if you look at the history, that's how American economy took
great
off
powers.
Back in the 19th century. They also ripped off a lot of intellectual property from the British. But after a certain time, now Huawei, nobody is accusing Huawei of stealing anything, because now Huawei, they dominate the 5G technology. They are now working on indigenously producing their own advanced chips, right? This is despite the U.S. sanction. So today's China is already moved beyond that. One of the common myths is that China cannot innovate, right? Which is but now we have moved from China cannot innovate to we must handicap China's AI industry by restricting semiconductor making equipments to China. Because now they do realize, okay, the idea that China, because these different economies, they go through different phases, right? Initially, by copying is how you learn. And then once you actually master how things work, then you start to innovate. Once you have an economy of scale, you have to innovate in order to stay ahead of your competitors. I mean, that's how market economy normally works. And so China is not staying ahead of US because it's copying intellectual property. China went through that phase, but now they're at forefront of driving innovation. And this is why they have 5G, they have hypersonic missiles, and they have all these very nice infrastructure in China, which does not exist in US, for example, high-speed train. And so this is why I urge people just travel to China. Seeing is believing. Let your lying eyes convince you. I've been, every time I go to China, it's like I'm traveling to a different place, a different new country. Everything gets updated, gets upgrading every few years. The physical infrastructure changed, but everything changed for the better. I remember traveling to China in 2000 to 2010s. At that time, I remember thinking to myself, China is a great place to visit for travel, but I would never live here because it was horribly polluted back then. And but 2019, when I went back to China, that's when I first realized, wow, this place is really cleaned up. I mean, not just big cities like Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen, but even like small border towns. I travel all the way to China's border with Myanmar because I had a expat friend who was teaching English there, and even the small towns are cleaned up. And they also cleaned up the environment. The air is much better today. I remember in 2010 when landing in Shanghai, you could cut the air with a butter knife, and the pollution was very horrendous. But today, I just came back from China on a recent trip last month. It's great. I see blue, clear sky everywhere I went, and the quality of life in general has gotten a lot better. Again, this is why survey after survey in China shows that people in China are generally optimistic about their future, whether 5 years from now or 10 years from now, which is in sharp contrast to a lot of the similar survey done in the Western countries. Today, in the United States in particular, we have a generation of Americans, Zoomers, who face worse economic prospect than their predecessors. Because I remember I had a roommate back in Huntington Beach back in 2009, 2010, and he was telling me, he's like, look, my roommate, he was a high school grad. He didn't go to college. He's a white dude, and he was saying, look, my parents, my dad was able to support his family, because his mom was staying home mom. His dad was able to support his entire family on his income as a postal worker back in the days, be able to afford a house, raise a family. But him at that time, he was telling him about himself. He said, I'm almost 30, yet there's no way I could afford a house and raise a family the same way that my dad did. And this was back in 2010, and today I think the situation might even gotten worse. And I also remember around the same time our company was hiring. So we hired a computer science graduate straight out of college. And I remember I knew his starting salary, and I was shocked because he was getting paid the same salary that I was getting paid back in 1999 when I first graduated college, more than 10 years ago. But of course, the prices has gone a lot higher in that 10 years. So these are the problems, real problems that exist in the United States, is people, especially youth, are facing a diminishing future. And this is why people are angry and demanding change in our government. Yet our government still persists in, like, the best thing we can do for you guys is war, right? Now we have to go to war in South America.
This is more geopolitical focused as well, because I think it's inevitable to talk about this with regards to China and the multipolar order. And I've always suspected this is kind of a myth, and I figured bringing you here could clarify this. You have these people in the think tank space in the United States that are convinced, because with Russia and China emerging, that there's this latent hostility under the surface between Russia and China that could be exploited, like it was in the 70s with like the Nixon visit to China. They think they could pull off a reverse Nixon where they could pry Russia off of China. What do you say to people that engage in that type of like assumption?
Well, this is again one of the popular copium. First of all, there's a lot of talk about reverse Kissingering. So I have to break it out, people. Kissinger did not engineer the Sino-Soviet split. Sino-Soviet split already happened.
Yes, Kissinger. 10 years before. Yes.
Already happened when Kissinger. So allow United States, allow Nixon and Kissinger to exploit that split. So this is quite different from the situation today. Today, there's no Sino-Russia split, right? So if you want to engineer a split, first you have to work a lot harder, and you don't do that by continue to slap sanctions against Russia and Russian oil, right? I mean, the whole China-Russia alignment, all in no small part to effort of the United States government. I mean,
yes.
Putin back in early 2000, he was asking Clinton's like, it was Clinton or Bush. He was like, let us into NATO, right?
Yeah, it was Clinton. Yeah.
Yeah. It was, so that was the late 1990s. So he was asking to be let into NATO, and Clinton told him no. First Clinton says, okay, maybe let me check with my people, and then later he come back says my people said no, not possible, which makes you question. Okay, Clinton, he's ostensibly the most powerful man, the leader of the free world. What kind of people does he have to go check? Who's really running the show here? Why does Clinton have to go check with his people, and then his people have to tell him no, right? And because now we know all the people who's really running the show is the military industrial complex, and like Putin said in his Tucker Carlson interview, it doesn't really matter who sits in the White House, as long as this kind of American primacy, U.S. hegemonic mindset virus infects their mind. It doesn't really matter who sits in the White House. They're all going to carry on the same policies as before. And as for China and Russia, I would argue today's China-Russian relationship was even a lot more stabler than the Sino-Soviet honeymoon period in 1950s. Because Sino-Soviet honeymoon happened was for ideological reasons, because they're both in the communist camp. Today's China and Russia, they're actually very different ideologically, but they are together because they have foreign partnership, because it's based on interest. It's an interest-based relationship. Russia is a major commodity producer. China is a major commodity consumer. So their economy is actually complementary. And they both have very long borders. So both countries have a vested interest to keep the peace among themselves. So for the Russian part, they still remember what happened, during the Sino-Soviet split. That allowed United States to come in to exploit that split and to peel China away. And at that time, United States did not peel China away because Sino-Soviet split already happened. So Nixon went to China to align with China against Soviet Union. But today, there's no split, right? So there's no reverse Kissingering, and even so, even despite all these talk, United States is not even throwing a bone to either China or Russia. Instead, it's slapping sanction against both. You're only pushing two countries to work even closer together. So a lot of this talk about how tension is going to suddenly break out between China and Russia, and then they're going to Russia is going to ally with U.S. versus China. This is Hopium. This is Hopium and another part of the Hopium and copium production coming out of Washington.
Yeah, I just think that the point you raised about how no matter who's in office in the United States, you're just not going to see a foreign policy where neoconservatism or neoliberal interventionism is going to be rolled back, and people are still really infected with the American exceptionalist mind virus, which they think they can defy laws of economics, geopolitics, and statecraft, and somehow say, because we're exceptional, we can win this great power competition and operate. Also, it's operating under 20th century assumptions that are flawed from the start, as you mentioned, with the Sino-Soviet split. I wanted to ask you about this because one thing that is really interesting, especially after the Russo-Ukrainian war, is the vassalization of Europe under the thumb of the United States. Do you think Europeans have a more sober analysis of China compared to the US, or is it just the same?
Well, right now we have a NATO General Secretary, Rutte, who was former Prime Minister of Netherlands, who called Trump daddy. I mean, that's just cringe, man. That's just really cringe. Who does that? And unfortunately, that's Europeans. Yeah, European leadership. They completely do not represent the interest of the European electorate. In fact, many of them were put in their place because they have been groomed for years by Atlantis' institution. They were put in their place to be voice of Washington rather than representative of the European people. And Europe is suffering right now. Europe is being deindustrialized because they've cut themselves off from the cheap source of energy, Russian gas and oil. And now they're asked by America to wage economic war on one of their biggest export market, China. This is crazy. Netherlands, they just went to the bat for the Trump administration when Trump rolled out the so-called BIS 50% rule in September 29, which expanded the blacklisted Chinese semiconductor company from 1,400 to 20,000. And because of that, Washington actually went to the Dutch government and says, okay, this company Nesperia, which is owned by a Chinese parent company, Wintech, if you don't do something about it, we're going to put it on our sanction list. So Dutch, instead of consulting with the Chinese on how to respond, they went ahead and they nationalized a Chinese company. They, under a wartime provision. And guess what just happened? During the Trump-Xi meeting in South Korea, as a result of that, U.S. actually rolled back that BIS 50% rule. So now that whole justification for Dutch government's action does not exist anymore. But now Europe is going to have to pay the consequences for being the loyal lapdog of the United States. One of that is the Chinese government told the Nesperia China, which actually do the manufacturing of the semiconductors, say, like, okay, your parent company, the Nesperia headquarters, was illegally seized by the Dutch government. You are under no legal obligation to listen to them anymore. So your first job is to supply semiconductors to the Chinese car companies domestically first. And for the other Europeans and Americans who want to access your semiconductor production, they have to sign the direct contract with you rather than going the Dutch headquarters. And so this is actually causing a major panic in the car manufacturers. The Germans and American automakers said they're weeks away from running out of semiconductors. Honda actually had to shut down their Mexican plant because of that. And this is all because the Dutch government's doing, and they did it on behalf of the United States, which itself had rolled back on its rules. So Europe, unfortunately, I see them play that role again and again. One reason is because the European leaders are deathly afraid of losing America's security guarantee over Europe. So they will do anything to please daddy, even at detriment of the European interest. But this is bad for Europe. And I fully expect some kind of voter revolt in the future on the part of the European electorate. They will have to hold their politicians, responsible, because these spineless EU leaders are leading Europe down a very, very dark place.
Oh, yes, it's becoming increasingly irrelevant. And speaking of geopolitical trickery and skullduggery, I'm also seeing some people in the United States that think they're very clever and thinking they can weaponize countries like India and Vietnam and use them to balance against China. Where do you see the folly in those strategies?
Well, first of all, if you want to do that, you don't slap them with tariffs, high tariffs, right? So, Trump, this is why Trump is my president. He is the best proponent of multipolarism. I mean, he's single-handedly tearing down the American imperial system right now. Not intentionally, but he's doing a great job. And there has been a sharp deterioration in ties between United States and India, particularly over India's purchase of Russian oil. China also purchased Russian oil, but United States couldn't do anything about China because China has more cards to play. So they thought they could go after India because they thought India is a weaker party. This, of course, was not received very well in New Delhi, and now all these hopes of turning these countries. I mean, just look at public opinion polls of the United States. Just within the last year, from 2024 to 2025, the U.S. global standing has already suffered a drastic fall. Just because Trump is waging tariff war on everybody, So yeah, I don't think U.S. is doing a great job, shooting itself in the foot in that regard. So I would not be too worried about that.
Yeah. No, it's actually kind of interesting too that Trump is in a way kind of like memeing the idea of like multipolarity, because also speaking of tariffs as well, US and Trump in particular, he's alienating countries like Colombia, like in South America, which has been the US's most reliable security partner in the region since the end of the Cold War. And now with the constant saber rattling against cartels they're actually pushing Colombia and Venezuela together. And you know what's funny, as somebody that's Venezuelan, they're almost creating the construct of like a Grand Colombia 2.0, because Grand Colombia used to be one nation. And this was also something that Hugo Chavez had kind of envisioned, not like a formal confederation, but like really more like a strategic concept. And it's actually hilarious because Trump has pushed that together. And he's also making, through intervening against China, Iran, or Russia, whether it's proxy wars, containment mechanisms, they're just making it they're creating incentives for those three countries to just not just gang up in Eurasia, but also gang up in South America and prop up governments there to like just give the U.S. fits.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? Right? It's just Trump is doing a great job. I hope he stay the God Emperor of America for another 1,000 years. But the United States is I think it's kind of like at we're at the very late stage of the imperial decline. That's why you see all these kind of crazy things coming out. I mean, this would never happen in like a peak imperial era, but
no, absolutely not. No. Yeah, the blowing up of those Fisher boats, the threats against like Nigeria now, and then this other threat against Iraq, against like this Shia militias, and also they're threatening Lebanon for not disarming Hezbollah. And I mean the Middle East thing too. It's so many things, and then also the AI bubbles and other the financialized economy you mentioned. This stuff has so many moving parts that could just go wrong and like create like a pretty catastrophic event. But yeah, I mean, this also makes me want to shift discussion to this recent paper that some people on social media are saying that perhaps signals a relaxation of tensions between the United States and China. This is put forward by the Rand Corporation. It's titled "Stabilizing the U.S.-China Rivalry." Do you think that this paper is a sign that there probably are people in the U.S. ruling class that are like saying, "Hey, let's pump the brakes a bit on this China containment project and recalibrate"? Or is this just going to be ignored and the same supremacist agenda of the U.S. is going to continue?
So I think this is what they call trial balloon. They're just floating these ideas out of the think tanks to test how they will be received. But now it does seem that now there's some voices within administration that's saying, okay, let's not go too crazy here on this China containment project because it's consuming way too much of our resources and it will make us look bad when we do fail. So let's focus on West Hemisphere. Let's focus on countries that we can push around. By that they mean countries like Venezuela. This is why now the U.S. is now doing. U.S. military is doing this major intimidation tactic by putting their military asset around Venezuela. This is not good for Venezuela, but I think there is some recognition that it's kind of hopeless case to contain China at this point. But it doesn't mean that they're going to give up. It doesn't mean that they're going to give up.
Yeah, it's actually a good point. That's one thing why I've liked what's his name, Brian Berletic's analysis, because the U.S. has a lot of ways to mess with countries, whether it's color revolutions, the use of private mercenaries, proxies, or even some of these weird kind of geopolitical subversion measures by using like India or Vietnam as battering rams, as futile as they may be, they'll try it. And I mean, even if the Venezuela thing doesn't turn into anything, Venezuela is still not going to be in the clear. There's going to still be subversion. There's still going to be something like that because next year, actually, the Petro in Colombia, he's going to be out of office, and they're probably going to have a color revolution there and install a puppet that's going to be very hawkish towards Venezuela. So this empire has a lot of tricks up its sleeve, but it's very much acting in an erratic manner because they just can't cope with the fact that a lot of countries want to exercise sovereignty and chart their own paths.
There's a recent article in Atlantic. It's called U.S. is losing. Is gonna U.S. is on its way to lose a war with China. Right, and it's listed. It's a little bit alarmist headline, but I have a crazy idea. Why don't we just choose peace? Why do we need to have a war with China? Right? I mean, like that's a fundamental question that people should be asking. Why doesn't the United States just choose peace? But we know why, because military-industrial complex that feeds on conflict. That's how they will continue to guarantee the taxpayers' money will continuously line their own pockets. This is why the perpetual war must go on. They have to just pivot from one conflict to another.
One problem too, going back to financialization and deindustrialization, the U.S. is such a erratic point in its imperial history that even its military industrial complex is having crises too. So it's like you now can't, like, this entity can't even justify itself because the basic resources it needs can't really be produced. This is it is like if they continue to push the envelope, they're looking at a systemic collapse, and how that'll look like, it's just beyond words. But well, man, I think this is a good place to stop. We covered a lot of ground, but I really enjoyed the discussion. But as always, Carl, thank you for coming on, and feel free to plug your podcast and other work you're doing these days.
Sure. So I do have my own YouTube. I'm a prolific shit poster on X.
Yes, you are.
My handle is just Carl Zha. A lot of the thing I do it just trolling, but if don't take it seriously unless it's true, then do take it seriously. I have my own YouTube channel, just under my name, Carl Zha. I also do a podcast, So Can Steal podcast on the Patreon site. You can go to Patreon and search So Can Steal, and that's where it's more a history focus on podcasts, where I focus on retelling the Chinese history chronologically from the very beginning. And right now I'm at 284 BC, so I still have a long way to go. I still have a couple thousand years, but I tend to live a long time, so I'm taking my sweet time doing it.
Oh, I think your takes and especially your posts on Twitter will live on for the eons, for the ages, man. But anyways, man, thank you so much for coming on to the show, and also to the audience, thank you for your attention. I'm José Niño. This is Headline Geopolitics. Until next time.